This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari. As regular listeners will know, the On Humans podcast hosts conversations with philosophers and human scientists on a variety of topics. But underneath the diversity of the weekly topics, there are a few themes that structure my search for guests and themes. One of these major themes has been love and care, the topic in episodes 1, 3, 7, and 9. Another major theme has been human origins and the evolution of our pro-sociality, a theme explored in episodes 1, 2, 6, and 8. Today's episode is launching a third such theme, something that will be developed in many episodes to come. This is the theme of the science of happiness, or in other words, the science of well-being, or even human flourishing. I hope to explore this theme from a variety of angles, but before doing so, I wanted to dig into the very foundations of any science of happiness. Can happiness really be measured? Are there any genuine findings that will stand the test of time? Is the whole project a Western quirk that cannot be translated or shouldn't be translated to other cultures? Is my native country, Finland, really the world's happiest country? My guest today is Dr. Alexandrova, a philosopher of science from Cambridge University, and one of the most clear-headed people I could have imagined talking with on this topic. Discussing it with her was really an immensely clarifying experience and a great pleasure. I hope you feel that way about it too. As always, the show notes include a full list of technical terms and names mentioned in this conversation. I hope you enjoy this tour to one of the most interesting scientific projects of our time. I bring to you Anna Alexandrova. Dr. Anna Alexandrova, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk about the science of well-being, science of happiness, using the terms interchangeably for now. You're a philosopher of science, which I think will be useful for us in a sense that you can take kind of a bird's eye view into a lot of these topics. But I wanted to start with a kind of bird's eye view of talking a little bit about the history of the field. So some of the people working in science of happiness research suggest that it's a very new endeavor. What would be a kind of quick overview of the philosophy of the field from your point of view?
It depends entirely how widely you zoom out. The very projects of identifying a value and trying to figure out how much of it there is in a given situation is probably one of the oldest questions in philosophy and ethics. Okay, the classics, classical thinkers in Greek and Roman philosophy rarely thought of value as quantifiable. But in the early modern period, we see a rise of that, of course, with the project of utilitarianism. And later on in the 19th century, with the rise of economics, we see more and more sophisticated attempts to say, well, the value is either the pleasure or desire satisfaction or some kind of flourishing. And the scale of it is, either intensity times duration or satisfaction of preferences or the number of choices you could make, something like that. But nevertheless, there is something new in the recent explosion of the science of well-being and in the recent community of social scientists who think of themselves as scientists of well-being. And the novelty is first that their identity is explicitly not as philosophers, but as scientists. And their methods are focused almost entirely on perfecting questionnaires or indicators, which is also something that scientists rather than philosophers obsess about. What is the valid indicator? What is the valid item to include on such and such survey? And finally, the other really important aspect to their identity is this big ambition to replace traditional understandings of welfare that they inherited from economics. So measurement of development or welfare by the amount of economic activity or the fruits of that economic activity, such as wealth and income. So if you take all of those things together, we do have a novel enterprise in the last 50 years, attempts to agree upon a certain set of measures of welfare attempts to collect enormous amount of data, either through Gallup surveys or other many kind of both academic and policy surveys, and then also try and understand what determines these quantities, uh, what sort of social arrangements, what sort of social upheavals bring that quantity up or down, what kind of interventions help people deal with dramatic disasters to their well-being, and so on. So that is new, I granted, and I don't like it when they talk as if no one's ever tried to measure and understand well-being. I think that is certainly not true, but I grant that they have started a project that has a distinct historical identity and that kind of contemporary ideal of lining up several ambitions: evidence-based policy, policy that's person-centered and sensitive to values. So I think that comes from the patients' rights movement and perhaps with the rise of social indicators in mid-century. And all of these together, plus positive psychology, plus the rise of a kind of commercial self-help and also managerial self-help, management of people's feelings in the workplace, in education. And all of those things together, we've got contemporary science of well-being.
I think it's interesting you mentioned positive psychology towards the end, because I wanted to ask you about the relationship that you see between kind of roots in positive psychology on the one hand and the roots in economics on the other. Because when I'm looking at the modern science of well-being, there really seems to be two kind of streams, where one is the gross national happiness instead of gross national product discussion. Here we have world happiness reports, etc. A lot of economists have been involved in this, and this really seems to grow quite directly from economics. And then there is a lot of this kind of science of good life. I mean, just anecdotally, for example, I think the most popular course at Yale University is Science of Good Life by Laurie Santos. She's a psychologist, and what I've learned from her is a lot of interesting things that have to do with, the same kind of questions, how can we measure well-being, what kind of things predict it. But this is much more about on the individual level. This would be much less about social policy inequality. This would be more about practicing gratitude and generosity and these kind of things that people have direct control over in their own life. And so, how distinct are these two strands in the research? Is it really like one research paradigm that it has this wing and that wing, or would you say that there's actually kind of two paradigms going on at the same time, one growing from economics and the other one growing from positive psychology?
Thank you. Very good question. In some way, yes, everybody thinks that science of well-being has to have something to do with subjective appreciation of life. And there is a place for subjective indicators and surveys. Everybody also agrees that the objective conditions and the subjective evaluation can come apart, as they do dramatically in the alleged Easterlin paradox. There are lots of things that people agree on. And nevertheless, you're quite right. People pursue science of well-being often in dramatically different ways. Positive psychology itself has had several rebirths moments, I think. When they start with these, very individualistic, let's look at your life, figure out, what is it that gets you sad and stops you from functioning at a high level. And let's figure out your special dose of gratefulness exercises for you to do better, or gratefulness exercises plus meditation or mindfulness or whatever. I think recently it has gone through the second wave and perhaps even the third wave. First, the appreciation of negative emotions as both distinctive to human nature and both very productive as well, and also the appreciation of deep social embeddedness of emotions, and perhaps even their their ended nature, in that they're just not in their head, they are also in your community and in your culture. I don't think it happened as much as I would like to, but nevertheless, positive psychology has made big strides, I would say.
You mentioned the Easterling paradox earlier. Before we get into the nitty gritty issues, I think it might be good to have some examples of what are kind of findings that have come from this field. So why don't we start with the Easterling paradox? What is it quickly, and what's your take? What is the current consensus, if there is one, on the Easterling paradox?
When Richard Easterlin published his data, he emphasized two facts: that within the same country, the income predicts high life satisfaction, but as income grows, life satisfaction doesn't always keep up. As a country becomes richer, it wouldn't. The life satisfaction doesn't always keep up. So, what is the state of play now? Well, I think more complicated than that is the answer. There's a lot more life satisfaction and income data than there were when Easterlin intervened, and many clever and creative economists have re-examined them recently and found that, in fact, there is a perfectly good growth in life satisfaction together with the growth of economic indicators if you look at it closely enough. So, to be honest with you, if you ask me now, is there such a thing as Easterlin paradox? I would probably say not in the way that he imagined, but I still think it has had this incredible importance of emphasizing that objective indicators can come apart dramatically, and we see that every now and then. So when the rise of the Arab Spring showed great growth in economic activity together with very poor life satisfaction. Thanks to Easterlin, we are now able to kind of identify and see the significance of these. And I would say that even if there is no kind of stable, a universal finding, there are plenty of examples of subjective and objective well-being coming apart. And it is these very examples that provide the most interesting data for researchers to sink their teeth in and to figure out what is going on.
Yeah, I think the idea that economic activity doesn't in itself is not in itself identical with happiness, with well-being. I think that was one of the very drivers of at least this economic side of the science of well-being. Was it in 2011 that the country of Bhutan sponsored a resolution at the United Nations on bringing happiness, gross national happiness, more forward in the way that we measure the performance of governments, and I think the World Happiness Report really grew out of that movement, if I understood correct.
I might not be completely exact about the dates, but yes, that was the big early and late knots. That decade of 2000 to 2010 was a huge impetus to all of this research. And even when you find out that what gross national happiness means in Bhutan might not be as palatable as you would like it to be, nevertheless, the brand is just so extremely attractive and influential, just the very moniker, that it took off. And now a lot of the industrialized countries have their own indices of happiness and indices of well-being, and they have their state statisticians collecting data on that and putting them together in yearly reports. And every now and then you find that, okay, it may not be that big policy decisions are really evaluated against this data, but there is at least a commitment that it will happen, that we will take this into account, and there is every European country at least has gone through a discussion of what does well-being mean to us as Germans or Italians or Greeks, and what kind of statistics should we collect in order to call ourselves as flourishing, and a lot of exchange between different experiences of how we would do that. So in that sense, Bhutan was a pioneer that set off a process that I think is still continuing, even as the world is going through the dramatic transformations, either due to pandemics or wars. In some ways, that project was already launched, and it's keeping going on its own steam.
And I guess very much embedded in that kind of Bhutanese approach would be the assumption that it might very well be in that subjective well-being. Happiness does not track GDP. Now, one thing though, I wanted to ask you about the Easterling paradox. I think there's two ways to think about whether income in a country is associated with happiness. One is whether when a country gets richer, do the people also get happier? And there at least Eastern is suggested that no. What I've seen of people who disagree with him suggest when they say yes, they're talking about very, very small differences. But then when you look at, for example, the World Happiness Reports, you see a pretty dramatic relationship. All the countries in the top 10 are rather rich countries, and I think almost all the countries at the bottom 10 are rather poor countries. And it doesn't sound like there's any question that there is some relationship between income and life satisfaction and happiness there. So can you help me walk through that? How could it be that it is such a difficult effect to find from the data, given that anybody who just glances for 3 seconds on the charts from the World Happiness Report would say, oh yeah, no, it seems to be that it's good to be in a richer country on average.
Great. Let's talk about the World Happiness Report that ever since its inception has always found Scandinavian countries, including your native country of Finland, to top.
Yes, I think we've topped the 5 years in a row now.
That is pretty impressive. I mean, if you look at that kind of robust data that keeps coming in, it is hard not to think that there is a clear mechanism behind it. It can't just be a fluke.
Yeah, it measures something. Whether it measures exactly happiness or what do we want to call the happiness is another question. But there seems to be something, yeah. And I think on the bottom also, just last year, I think the country at the very bottom was Afghanistan, which I think is exactly what one predicts.
So when you look at dramatic and robust differences like that, you want some explanation for it. And what I would like to happen, and what I do not always see happening, is sophisticated theoretical work in examining what those mechanisms are. What we tend to do in the science of well-being is to just run a lot of statistics against whatever things we can find: GDP, education system, levels of inequality, levels of trust in government, cohesiveness of society, I don't know, cultural differences within society, all sorts of things. And you just regress it against those subjective indicators to try and find something that explains it. I mean, that is in some ways a very impoverished approach, because it doesn't really get us to understand how is it that Scandinaves answer these questionnaires. Perhaps, what is it that they understand by life satisfaction? Is there some kind of a cultural effect there, or is the effect more driven by the social conditions?
Well, I think one of the evidence that is often promoted as suggesting that it must be the social conditions and culture is when immigrating to these countries tend to very rapidly report very similar levels than the native people. And I think maybe one thing to notice also is that am I correct that World Happiness Report is not just about life satisfaction? So how happy are you with your life? Would you change anything about your life? But it also measures questions like how many times did you laugh yesterday? Did you learn something interesting yesterday? Were you angry or worried yesterday? So it also has this kind of positive, negative emotion aspect in addition to the life satisfaction aspect.
Yeah, I think it's improved a lot over the years
Hmm.
in enriching. It's just the emotional range of things that are examined. I really appreciate that. So we get a whole load of pointers to the mechanisms, but in order to examine, uh, in order to really sort of dig underneath, you need to be a little bit less averse to theory than psychologists and economists are. And that theory, has to be, just has to go beyond the theoretical tools that they're comfortable with, which is, experimental results, rational choice modeling, or something like that. I guess I would like to see much more involvement of qualitative social scientists who are able to talk us through and figure out, at least point towards people's understandings of how they treat these questions and people's experiences of the social conditions as they're reflected in their answers in these surveys. So, yeah, if there were more anthropologists and sociologists who do qualitative research involved in the World Happiness Report, I would be much, much more comfortable saying that it actually measures and demonstrates greater happiness of a given country over another.
So I guess we can say that the robustness of the findings suggests that it is tracking something. It's not just a fluke, but then kind of shallowness of the data, the lack of textured qualitative analysis, you would say, raises concerns about, well, what is it exactly measuring?
Quite. And I think there's a lot of realization, I think, in psychology about what they call the theory crisis or the theory freedom. And that means their own, they're themselves beginning to understand that they're often much more comfortable crunching data and doing what Dan Hayburn calls correlation mongering in one of our joint papers than in trying to understand the super complex phenomenon that is well-being and trying to begin to even describe the mechanisms that connect people's social conditions and their evaluation.
Okay, well, let's bracket the World Happiness Report for a while. Let's just raise the question of, can science study well-being? What are the possible measures? So I already mentioned two, one of them being life satisfaction, and then the other one being the positive versus negative emotions. So on the one hand, you can ask people, how satisfied are you about your life? So I think some people call this happiness with your life. And then alternatively, you can ask people things like, how many times did you laugh yesterday? Or how are you feeling right now? Are you feeling positive or negative? What did you worry? Are you stressed, etc.? But you talk about the big three in your book, a philosophy for science of well-being. And the third one would be eudaimonic happiness. So could you talk a little bit about the third option?
The third option, in some ways, is the most complicated one. You've got, the first one is just to get people to give a cognitive evaluation of how they think they're doing. The second one is to try and bypass the cognitive evaluation, get straight to the emotions. And the third one is to figure out whether or not someone is flourishing in a wider sense. Here's what's happening to flourishing in the contemporary sciences. On the one hand, many researchers, very inspired by Aristotle's original thought that there is something that it is like for creatures like us to flourish. And there is something that creatures like us, needy, social, seeking, doubting, all need. And when they're able to realize those needs and push their capacities, higher than they otherwise would, that's when they're flourishing. I mean, the idea itself is so, so attractive. And it is so kind of iconic and definitive and
Yes.
in Western, at least, thought. and it's got plenty of similarities to thoughts in other traditions, that it's hard to ignore it. And yet, at the same time, often enough, nowadays, when psychologists say they're interested in flourishing, they say that they're interested in perceptions of meaningfulness, right? Which is a lot less than that. It's not what Aristotle meant by.
Well, how would you measure? I think the problem here is, how do you measure flourishing without importing too much of the researchers' values about what they think is flourishing? How do you stay? In a sense, I guess the beauty about asking how happy are you with your life is that I might have a completely different view of what a good life is than the person I'm asking, but we might both converge on saying, oh, we're both really happy about our life. When talking about flourishing, I guess many people would worry that there starts to be too much value judgment in the science itself. What would be your response to someone who says, well, the flourishing is all well and good, and we can talk about it in the philosophy courses, but we shouldn't import it in this science. The science needs to be pure of the values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not like flourishing has more values imported into it than lots of other social science projects. So I don't think flourishing is very distinctive in being value laden. Measurement of inequality and development and sustainability and health, all sorts of projects in social sciences are deeply, deeply value laden. But your other objection is the unmeasurability of it. And for Aristotle, it would be, that's the whole point. But it is a crazy idea in the first place to think about the quantity of flourishing.
Yes.
You flourish or you don't, and there are so many different ways of flourishing that it would be crazy to have this conceit of a scale to it. And Nicomachean ethics starts with the idea that we should only expect as much precision as the subject matter allows. So that would be rejected outright. So I think nowadays contemporary scientists walk this very, very tricky line, which they often fail. On the one hand, really wanting to pay homage to the attractive ideal of flourishing, and that seeming inescapable intuition that a lion who sits in the cage is not well, even if that lion is happy.
Yes. I love that example of the lion. I think that is exactly the intuition that I also approach the question of flourishing from. I think that's why it's such a profound question about understanding ourselves, understanding humans. Is to understand an animal, you have to understand what would be the equivalent of being in a cage for a lion. But I mean, would you say that the lion can be? I mean, I think another objection would be to say that yes, but the lion is not happy. That's the whole point.
Well, the lion can presumably not be made to suffer too much in the cage with, a good enough of an experience machine. A reasonably good emotional state combined with, very oppressive and tragic arrangements.
Just to return on the point of values for a moment, the reason I really wanted to bring this point up is that you seem to be a little bit uncomfortable in your book with people who really want to keep science kind of value neutral. But on the other hand, you give this really, really good example, I think, of the kind of worry that people might have if too much of our values is baked into the scientific measurements. So you write, quote, consider a stark example. A researcher is a staunch Aristotelian about well-being who believes that an immoral person could not possibly flourish. So she inserts a virtue constraint into her measure of well-being. Using this measure, she finds that well-being is very low among sociopaths. Clearly, this finding is determined in part by her initial value judgment. In this sense, it fails the impartiality test, unquote. And for me, this was a very profound point, and this really makes me more and more want to stick to these kind of questions like life satisfaction and positive emotion, because I think one of the really beautiful things that this kind of science of well-being can do is that it can help us answer the questions of, is being pro-social and generous good for your happiness? I mean, it's good for other reasons for sure, but is it also good for your happiness? And if we would bake it into the idea, oh, what it means to be a flourishing happy person is to be generous, then we cannot answer the question anymore. And so much of what attracts me to this field, I think, is these kind of questions of I want to be making a claim that might be proven false when I'm saying that living a moral, ethical life is also a happy life. And if ethics is just baked into the meaning of happiness, then it becomes a meaningless state. It wouldn't be wrong anymore. So what's your thinking around this example of a staunch Aristotelian who believes that you have to be ethical to be flourishing, and therefore finds that sociopaths alone flourish?
Thank you for bringing it up. That is very helpful, the way you put it, that if we went with the staunch Aristotelian mode, then we wouldn't be able to study a perfectly reasonable and a perfectly interesting and important question. That is the effect of various prosocial behavior on one's subjective state. Nevertheless, when I put this example together, I didn't mean it to bash the Aristotelians in particular, because I think that defining well-being as life satisfaction also precludes seeing certain interesting effects and correlations. So if to be well is just to be satisfied with your life, then you would never see the misery that lies behind, a cold cognitive judgment that, all things considered, my life meets a certain ideal that I have thought it should meet, right? So my colleague Dan Hayburn's written a lot about how much compatibility there is between high life satisfaction and deep depression. So for me, the solution is not to try and eliminate values as far as possible. If we eliminate values, then we wouldn't be studying phenomena that are significant. That's like Max Weber 101 for me. It is a responsibility of a social scientist to study significant phenomena. Significant phenomena are the ones that value judgments apply to. Therefore, science of well-being needs to be evaluated science. The solution, on the other hand, is to promote a value-laden science that is really aware and multiple and diverse and entertains different kinds of values and tries to make sure that the paradigm of science of well-being, to the extent that it exists, is one that is genuinely responsive to the varieties of values that we can adopt.
Well, let's talk about the diversity a little. I guess there is already a virtue in, for example, the World Happiness Reporting, that it does have this diversity of having both a satisfaction and the positive versus negative emotion component in it, at least nowadays. And there you find interesting differences. I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but my take on it, correct me if I'm wrong, is that income predicts satisfaction a bit better than positive versus negative emotion. And for example, countries in Latin America are staunch outliers in having very high positive versus negative emotions, much more than the economists' models would predict them to have. So they're always, Finland is the happiest country, and Costa Rica is the happier, and it should be based on all the economics countries. So there is a little bit of diversity already in there. But now the question is, first of all, we can ask, are these two things enough? Is it enough to ask just about satisfaction and then about positive versus negative effects? Should we also include some more broad flourishing metrics, etc.? But then we can also ask the question, well, are these fundamentally measuring something unified? Are these all just different ways to ask about one thing, happiness, well-being? Which is, at least implicitly, but also I think explicitly, what the World Happiness Report suggests, because it pulls these all together. Finland, overall, #1 happiest country in the world. And what strikes me as interesting here is that even with things that nobody would really deny that there's objectivity in it, like medicine, health in medicine, we don't really end up doing those kind of, let's pool all health indicators and say, who is the healthiest person in the world, or what is the healthiest country even in the world. We're very happy in studying very specific question, what is the rate of cardiovascular disease in this country? And so there is this kind of, I think, healthy diversity in medicine, which you don't necessarily see it in the same sense really in the science of happiness. So what do you think about this issue? This kind of like, is it all one? Should we just be happy with using different measures? Kind of question.
Mhm. Thank you for the opportunity to jump on my favorite hobby horse and to talk about the fact that a single theory of well-being nor a single metric of well-being is necessary or desirable for all purposes. So one idea that I try to develop in the book is the very concept of well-being. Whenever we bring it up in conversation, public or private, very quickly, the context in which we're talking fixes to some extent the content of well-being ascriptions.
So what would be an example of that?
So, for example, when you're talking to a very close friend of yours, and the friend asks you in a deep voice, "How are you really doing?" They're asking a very different question than your financial advisor when you go see them, or that your doctor, or that your teacher asks, or that a politician asks about their constituents. How are they doing? What happens in the cases of well-being is that we operate in each context with an implicit mid-level theory of what well-being is for that context. When I offer my services as a volunteer to recent refugees, I offer them my services to, what I mean by their well-being. And when I ask how you're doing is, well, have you managed to open a bank account, and have you managed to sign up for benefits, and how do you understand a little bit how to use the public transport system, and etc. So that's very different sense of well-being that I have in mind than when I try to figure out whether my child is doing well when they're back from school, or whether my friend is showing signs of distress that is somehow deeper and more complicated. So these mid-level theories, a theory of well-being for the context of recent refugees, children at school, children in care, patients with such and such illness, best friends having a deep conversation, politician talking to their constituents. These are all different well-beings. And I am completely comfortable with that kind of diversity. And when I say that well-being research and well-being science should be pluralistic, as I do in a recent paper with Polly Mitchell that I'm very proud of, we mean all of those things. We mean that the sciences of well-being shouldn't try to settle on a single correct measure of well-being, and we know that there should be a single set of methods for detecting what well-being is. I'd like us to recognize the great diversity in both conceptions of well-being and the methods that we use. And I say that with full realization that diversity isn't always good for science, because it, again, let's go back to Thomas Kuhn. Normal science cannot even begin if you have a certain level of pluralism. But, well, too bad then, right? I guess I'd rather have a system of knowledge, and a system of knowledge production that is sensitive to the variation in meaning for the phenomenon, than the one that tries to discipline it into some kind of a straitjacket, which is what my problem is with contemporary sciences of well-being, including positive psychology.
What do you then think about the analogy from health? Do you think that's a helpful analogy?
Thank you. Good. So, is there a single measure of health? Well, I'm sure the WHO thinks there is, right? At least for purposes of producing yearly reports or ranking countries on how they deal with mortality and morbidity. And yes, and there probably are certain headline indicators like that that can serve as a good enough of a measure of health. And usually in those cases, what it means to be healthy is just a negative definition, is not to have
Yes.
diseases, right? But there is no kind of positive content to it. So we don't rank countries on their positive well-being. And that's precisely because it is just a fantastically controversial concept. And one of my very favorite inspiring papers by Christopher Boas, when he argues against the um, positive notions of health, is precisely that it's a recipe for a perfect human, basically. And
Yes, yes.
neither medicine nor psychology nor economics should be in the business of producing that.
Well, I think that is one of the reasons why I used to prefer the term well-being to happiness, because I felt there was something real cheap about happiness. It's a little bit like, here's my roller coaster versus well, it felt a little bit more profound. But I think my opinion has changed a little bit, exactly because I feel like the danger with the term well-being is that it really is kind of trying to capture this almost everything that we could say is about life versus happiness, maybe because it is more about the smiles and the satisfaction with your life status at the moment. I guess because it is more narrow, perhaps more shallow, at least in a sense, it is just another measure. So I can say, well, I'm not happy at the moment, but there are these other good things in my life. I'm not saying that maybe it's just a connotation issue for how I used using the terms, but what do you what do you think? Do you have any comments on that?
I mean, it's a great example of a very general dilemma we face in science. And that, when we can study a very small aspect of a phenomenon, we can study light by, I
Mm,
don't know, detectable number of photons, or we could have a much wider conception of the phenomenon. Like a photographer,
mm,
they would talk about quality of light,
mm,
of
mm,
light that is much wider. For purposes of science, you need to figure out um, which aspect of a phenomenon that's often vague and diffuse and rich and multitudinous and multidimensional. Which one is going to be the stand-in that would enable you to develop a research program? It's a There is a genuine dilemma there. How rich and how inclusive do you go? And very often in history of science, we have seen, the solution would be just to stomp your foot and say, this is what we're going to mean by mass. This is what
yeah.
we're going to mean by light. This is what we're going to mean by well-being. And just keep going. And perhaps, if we judge by success, if we judge success by who in the end wins out historically, then it is often the splitters and the narrowers. And
But you push back.
yeah, yes, indeed. So my job would be just to stand and shout from the rooftops that would be a big
That's good.
mistake to do that in case of well-being. I don't care if I'm on the wrong side of history.
Well, but I think that the reason I wanted to bring the analogy of health is, I guess I was wrong in saying that there you never see these overall measures of ranking countries by their health. But when it comes to the way that these findings are portrayed in the media, when it comes to health news, a lot of it is there's this, there's opioid crisis here, and there is pandemic now there, and what about what raises cardiovascular disease, and why is the cardiovascular disease rate lower in this country than that country? So there is focus on these very well carved out issues. I think more than in the science of happiness, science of well-being field, where so I, for example, love reading the World Happiness Report from all the details. It's just wonderful. Oh, it worry seems to be um, converging, so that Eastern European countries used to have much more worry than Western Europeans, and it's been converging for a decade. Whoa, that's a really interesting finding. I love reading stuff like that. Finding which countries in the world have most laughter, which areas have most. I think it was East Asia that had most laughter actually in the recent. But these kind of you know the more carved out individual questions, I feel like, are just fascinating to learn about. But then when you pool them all together into this one happiness index where Finland comes at the top, there is something interesting about it. But there's the obvious question, for example, well, how do you balance them out? Like, how much weight do you give to the laughter versus the I am happy with my life as it is question. And it seems to me that that's kind of where it takes the leap from being almost as objective as this could ever be to, well, now there's a lot of the researchers just putting their own kind of emphasis on this in order to create this one metric.
Thank you. I strongly agree with this sentiment that we can go along with a lot of the findings of science of well-being, and then jump off at the moment when it starts aggregating indicators
Yes.
into a single one. Quite a lot of colleagues are worried about that. So, a recent really important paper by Johanna Thoma of LSE talks about why it is not necessary or desirable or important for policy to have a single indicator aggregating all things of value. And I myself have also strong views about the problems with that. So one, it's not just the World Happiness Report that tries to do it. One trend that is picking up steam in the UK, and unfortunately so, in my view, is this concept of a well-be. Well-be is like quality. Quality is quality adjusted life year. Well-be is a well-being adjusted life year.
Mhm.
Yeah, and once again, it is that indicator that uh, uh, the master number to rule them all.
Yes.
In some ways, that would be plugged into cost benefit analysis instead of traditional valuation techniques that economists use. I think it is just a huge mistake partly for the reasons that you're describing, that that kind of integration is problematic and actually hides quite a lot of value judgments.
Mm.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is precisely the fake precision that I have very little epistemic grounds to trust.
Well, so far, I guess the tone has been cautiously pessimistic, but you're not a pessimist in a sense of just denouncing the whole field. But there are such pessimists. What I'm sure that you encounter people who say that it's impossible to study well-being, it's impossible to study happiness objectively, scientifically. What are the most common arguments worthy of reciting that you hear? What would be the most charitable way to make
Yeah,
it?
let me present you a library. Studying happiness is a recipe for domination and oppression, because, we'll be expecting people to be happy at their work and in their uh, place, when this should be sort of a political
Yes.
objection
Or
to
would this be more about the positive psychology side, less the economists side, which brings
possibly, yeah. So other objections are just, just take your standard philosopher, not, well-being is just far too complex and far
Mm,
too deep and far too diverse to ever have a science about. The problem with all of these objections is that they caricature science and they caricature politics.
mm,
And
mm,
they caricature science because, science always throughout its history has dealt with phenomena that sometimes feel like they're too big to bite in. They are just too complex, too multidimensional. Well, and the key is to figure out how to carve it up, and how to resolve that dilemma that we've just talked about between diversity and unity. Um,
mm,
it's so just like we've managed to have a science of many complex phenomena, uh, we shall manage to have a science of well-being, and we have a responsibility to do so. If you think we need a science of how to deal with climate change and how to rearrange our lives in a way that make them more sustainable, if you think it is possible to have knowledge about that, you should also think it's possible to have knowledge about well-being, right? And the objectors on the political side, again, are just a little bit too fatalistic, that as soon as we start having a science of well-being that is just a way of manipulating people.
Mm.
Well, politics of a science can genuinely change and shift. So again, let me plug in a work of a colleague that I value a great deal called Federico Brandmeier, who writes about political flexibility of social theories, how some social theory can at one moment feel like an instrument of a certain political project and then switch its allegiances very quickly. So I think the science of well-being can be emancipatory just as much as it can be manipulative.
Yes, yes. And I think
And
that's why it was interesting for me, the Bhutan example as the origin, that it did not originate in San Francisco Bay Area. I mean, this is
right.
just how some people, I think, put this whole Poland divide on. So I guess it's always difficult to validate these concepts because we kind of want to have a balance of being both a little bit surprised and a little bit unsurprised. I mean, Afghanistan comes out during war as the happiest country in the world, and we might do a little bit like, oh, what's happening with our measurements that we wouldn't predict necessarily this. But then again, you also want to be a little bit surprised because otherwise you learn nothing. But what are some of your favorite attempts to validate these measures? I mean, I think one of the things you mentioned in your book, for example, is a very, I think it was in the 80s, a classic study in Wisconsin where life satisfaction ratings of elderly people correlated very well with textured qualitative interviews about how well these elderly people are. What are some other examples? What would be your favorite examples of how these measures, so that the measures correlate with things that we would want them to correlate with?
Well, there is a lot of well-being science that I admire just because the findings are important and should not be ignored. So, for example, in the findings about deaths of despair in United States are all examples of findings that people in horrible situations, poverty-wise, addiction-wise, are the ones that also report enormous amount of misery and are the ones that whose mortality and health is just in a very dangerous state. I mean, to uncover this and to present it as a robust and widespread phenomenon for the politicians to notice is one of the great achievements, I think, for a social scientist to have. But you also asked about good practices in validating measures, which is slightly different. Good practices in approaching this question of what measures we should be using. And in here, my views are that I respect scientists who do not claim that there is a pre-validated, pre-packaged measure that you could use because it came out in a big journal, the validation exercise. Validation is always contextual, and it is always relative to a population and to a purpose. So I'm very excited about the rise of participatory techniques when the stakeholders who are the stakeholders of a study of well-being? Well, it is the scientists who are undertaking it because they wanted to get it right. It is the policymakers who might use this material to balance their budgets, determine how they're going to spend their money. And it is the people whose lives this is supposed to be describing. So once you have such a wide understanding of for whom science of well-being works, you are going to have responsibility to include all of those views and to understand that each type of stakeholder has a distinctive kind of expertise about what well-being is for them. And the participatory methods that were pioneered very much by health scientists to include patients in decisions about what outcome measures are going to be used. But nowadays are more common with capabilities approach, scientists, researchers who include, say, indigenous populations in the decisions about what are the core capabilities that should be considered? What are the core positive freedoms that need to be measured in order for you to say that a community is doing well? I myself had the honor to participate in such a participatory project a couple of years ago with a UK charity called Turn to Us. So my collaborator, Mark Fabian, and I, we participated in a co-production exercise for a anti-poverty charity in the UK, Turn to Us. They wanted a measure of thriving, and even more basically, a concept of thriving that is specific to their users, to their clients who are people in sudden financial need. So we had the privilege of co-producing it precisely with those three groups of stakeholders that I think each have something to say about what makes a measure valid. And they have very different perspectives on that, and it will often be very difficult to balance it. But I think that is the next frontier to make well-being science properly participatory. And, if we only ever think of people as respondents to our surveys, that's just not a respectful way of doing science of well-being. It's just not it's one that does not grant the possibility that people have things to say about what their well-being consists in, not just being able to provide us with a rating.
Yes. I think one of the big questions about validity of these results, so basically, do these results from, for example, the World Happiness Report actually measure the thing that we want to call happiness? One of the worries for many Finnish people is that they look at the results and they're like, nah, we can't possibly be the world's happiest nation because we don't smile a lot on the streets. We're not known to be jolly people. But also, maybe more seriously, it's very difficult to get cross-national data on depression rates because it varies so much with the healthcare practices. But Finland often ranks very high on prevalence of depression, higher than many OECD countries, higher than, for example, Sweden, which is, I think, interesting because Sweden ranks much lower than Finland in the World Happiness Report. Well, so how can Finland both be the happiest while also be one of the most depressed? Relatively high suicide rates. This is often just makes a lot of Finnish people kind of shrug off the finding. I'm very curious to hear your answer because I'm very undecisive about how to look at this phenomenon. I think that it's not as clear cut as, well, the World Happiness Report is wrong. I think that they use very good measures which clearly tell something, but it's a reasonably understandable response. How could the world's happiest country be also a very highly depressed country? So how do you think about that kind of tension?
Well, the first hope is that there are some serious Finnish researchers that just sink their teeth into the possible mechanisms and examine the full range of quantitative and qualitative data that are relevant to understanding how it is that it's possible to top a certain. Is it that life satisfaction seems to crowd out other indicators, and life satisfaction, we know, is perfectly compatible with high levels of depression.
Oh, really? Okay.
I mean, because just implicitly, if you think about it, just asking a question that is not about how you feel, but rather about your stance on life. That's
But Finland is relatively high also on the positive emotion versus negative emotion.
well, yeah. So, and if it is if it is so, then there has to be some other
Yes.
explanation that is Finland specific, and which it all speaks for the need of a more sophisticated and a more theory focused and a more mechanism focused science of well-being, which I think either we don't have or is not nearly as high profile as it should be.
Yeah.
That's my main hope.
Yeah, I personally, whenever the reports come out, my first reaction is to say, well, no, there's something wrong about this data. It can't be Finland. But then if I start to think about, well, which country is it? I do struggle because I guess every country has their problems. Maybe that's part of it. Some of the things I'm not concerned about, for example, the high suicide rates. I think that's very much that's a very social issue. It has a lot to do with cultures around suicide. Places like Japan have high levels of suicide, not necessarily because Japanese people are miserable, but because it is a culturally acceptable thing versus compared to, for example, Islamic cultures, which have a very high stigma around suicide. So I think that's part of that can explain the, the the suicide part. Another thing is that I guess depression is not the only thing that is considered to be almost like the opposite of happiness. I think anxiety disorders are, for example, much lower relatively in Finland than depression. So those are some of the kind of crumbs that I found when I tried to think through this issue. But I really don't know what to think about it. It is a puzzling phenomenon, I think.
I imagine that whenever it comes out, there is this slew of journalistic work on that, right? But
Yeah.
let's hope that we get past that, that it is.
Yeah. I hope it would be better quality in sense of having this kind of now rather than opinion columns which are witty about this matter. I would rather maybe see some roundtable discussions.
I would be very curious to know if Finland co-produced its own metric of well-being, what would be in it?
Yes. That's
and whether the same things that would be in it would be the ones that World Happiness reports.
Yeah. But sometimes those things do bring kind of just the same old findings. There was an interesting thing, I think, in 2022 in the World Happiness Report. They included measures on low arousal positive states. So before it was more about high arousal positive states like laughter, excitement. And then they included more low arousal things like tranquility, calm, because of criticism that, for example, Asian cultures value low arousal states more relatively than Western cultures. And so that we should include these more. And the results were that this didn't change the results. So they included them, and still it was the Nordic countries that have more tranquility, calmness versus East Asian countries, for example. So I it's wonderful that it was included, but I guess it also then it's you never know what the answer will be, kind of.
Great. I hope that next time we talk, there will be some proper mechanistic research.
Yes.
Into
into
that.
That's right. Yeah. I always just get back to this word that there's too many things that make sense, and these are for this to be complete nonsense. There must be something in here, but when you just aggregate them all in one, it comes at the top. I am a little confused of what should I do with this information.
The solution is not to try and appeal to what makes sense to us, right?
Yes.
The solution is to do a very specific and focused research on the curious case of Finland.
Yes, well, that's an excellent bridge to your. I think one of your current research themes is the role of expertise in general. I heard you talk about this sometimes, saying that part of the reason you're interested in expertise is because of your own experience in youth, in childhood, growing up in Soviet Union and post-Soviet Union Russia. Would you like to talk a little bit about that link?
Experts play this really essential and visible role in at difficult junctures in a society, right? Whenever you have a pandemic, whenever you have a war, whenever you have a collapse of an old empire, you've got these heads on TV that or on Twitter that explain things to you. And they are very hard to resist, those heads, especially the ones that are kind of well-spoken and insightful and inspiring. And they create this impression that it is possible to have an understanding and a knowledge of social processes that are genuinely scientific or superior or somehow epistemically better than others. So from the beginning of my conscious life, I have been fascinated with, whether or not these experts should be trusted and to what extent. And it's possible to imagine very extreme responses. Yes, experts, no experts, and lots of things in between.
So what were the experts like in the beginning of your conscious life? Who were the experts and what were they telling?
Well, the whatever teachers that sat me down in kindergarten to watch Brezhnev's funeral in front of TV, right? Or then told me what is a good young pioneer, what should they be like, or then with the collapse of Soviet Union, there was this influx of various missionaries, mainly from America, that are presented themselves as experts on good life. And then when it all opened up in the 90s, the experts were the economists who advocated shock therapy, the psychologists who described that women are thus and men are thus, and so on. I mean, so my project, Expertise Under Pressure, which is just completing, we try to understand the distinctive way in which the recent crop of experts, be they about well-being or about masks and face covering, or about lockdowns, or about how cities should be organized, and how we should combat inequality. The recent crop of experts, what has been the opportunities that they've picked on, how have they done things well, how have they tried to, what mistakes they made, and how they have tried to establish their credibility. We've done some studies on the distinct anxiety that experts called to speak about the pandemic policy have experienced. And all of that is on the Expertise Under Pressure website.
Incidentally, am I wrong? This might be a pure coincidence, but Jeffrey Sachs is one of the founding editors of the World Happiness Report. I think that he was also one of those experts in the 90s in Soviet Union, one of those economists you mentioned.
Who flew in from Chicago or from Washington to recommend certain liberalization policies, of course, claiming that he also meant it to come with a great deal of social support, and to avoid the dramatic welfare consequences for most Soviet citizens. And now he is a foremost expert on happiness. I mean, I don't have anything negative to say. Clearly, he's a very talented and inspiring and energetic person to do whatever, to offer his expertise wherever it is currently most needed. And I'm sure that, sometimes he makes mistakes, or people redeploy his expertise in the way that he didn't mean it to be. But yeah, it's a great example of a talking head that is still talking.
Yes. I guess for his sake, as you said, it's probably not the case that the 90s economic policy in Soviet Union was exactly what he would have wanted it to be.
I believe that.
But yeah, let's leave that all aside. There's a lot of worry, I think, in many circles that people trust experts less and less. This was something during the pandemic that there was worry. I guess the worry would be about both on the left and the right being strong movements of people who denounce science, who denounce expert consideration. There was whether it is vaccine or anti-vaxxers or anti-maskers, and I think this conversation, I think, has toned down a little. But I remember in 2020 there was this question: do people trust science? Do they trust experts on these kind of matters? Do they go with the vibe? On the other hand, I think there's also the concern of economies becoming more and more bureaucratized, in a sense that things are kind of outsourced. Even happiness is outsourced to the experts. So what kind of advice would you give to experts who want to be respected to the level that their expertise merit, who are worried about people simply denouncing experts, but equally are worried about taking too much burden to carry in, for example, being the expert in happiness who knows everything about it? How do you navigate this dilemma as an expert?
The first thing to say is that when we talk about the crisis of expertise, I think you yourself have alluded, it's not really clear what we're talking about. Is it I mean, yeah, we do see some high-profile announcements and claims about, how this country had enough of experts, so we no longer trust in experts, and experts are this and that. At the same time, you have this dramatic high standing of certain experts in, during the pandemic, would be it Anthony Fauci or Patrick Vallance or some other characters. And we also have, huge expertization of many spheres that didn't have experts before, such as terrorism or warfare or HR treatment of your workers. So it's not really clear that we are living through a crisis of expertise. I think we're living through a great deal of anxiety about expertise, which is sometimes at least well focused and well placed, while also often exploited and made worse, specifically in order to serve interests. So uh, colleagues like Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway have written about the merchants of doubts, the payment towards experts to raise doubts about climate science. So we're living through, explosive politics of expertise at different levels rather than a single crisis of it. And were you asked what's the right way to do it? Well, I think expertise is compatible with democracy. I think expertise is based first and foremost on a need to divide epistemic labor. Some of us are going to know some things, others are going to know other things. We cannot all know the same things at once. And it is possible to organize our political system in a way that respects the fact that such a division of labor is necessary and does it responsibly. It is definitely possible to make expertise and democracy work together. But for an individual expert, what advice I have? The individual expert has their work cut out for them. They have to decide what is their level of certainty, whether the knowledge they have is appropriate to the situation, whether how they should communicate this knowledge, whether they should seek maximal transparency about the process, or whether it's okay for them to speak into a closed room. Um, uh, Honestly, there is no recipe here. Whenever we think there is a recipe, there's always a counterexample. It is very important for experts to feel they're not employees or politicians. It's very important for experts to not feel like they have to work to be in the room, because as soon as they try to work to be in the room, their incentives are warped and they start saying what others want to hear. So how to, grow and respect and cherish the people who are going to divide epistemic labor with us is a major task of contemporary democracies. But I certainly think it can be done better or worse, and it can be done well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, before we end, having spent years and years reading about well-being, happiness, flourishing in humans, what do you say? What would have been things that might have changed in your outlook on humans when you ask the question, "What kind of animals are we?" What are some things that might have changed in the way you look at our species that has changed throughout your your career, your thing?
When I started off in philosophy, I was really inspired by the idea of evidence-based policy. And to some extent, I still believe in that. But I also think that human beings are these creatures that kind of condemned to repeat certain mistakes, precisely because it is our essential process of growing. We each only get one life to live, and it's not really realistic that we would have imbibed all the knowledge that the previous generations have assembled in order to make our life the best it possibly can be, right? There will be certain mistakes, be they due to pride, hypocrisy, confirmation bias, hopefulness, or whatnot. that will come back again and again. And I guess what I have learned about human nature is that these learning and doubting creatures, they need, stable institutions and responsible social arrangements in order for those experiments in living that we are all condemned to repeat, not to end up in disasters every single time.
Dr. Anna Alexandrova, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for sticking with us until the very end of this conversation. If you enjoyed it, please consider sharing it with a friend. You can either share it with them directly or just mention next time you met that you heard something they might enjoy. If you have any thoughts about this episode, other episodes, things that we should cover in the future, things that I might have screwed up, things that you want to hear more about, or just want to say hi, please feel free to drop me a line. You can do it either via the podcast website or sending me an email to makela.ilari@outlook.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from listeners. But that's all for now. Until next time, take care.